In 1985, a man sat down for an interview and said something that sounds like it belongs in a movie, except the engineers had the printout right there in front of them, and the numbers didn't lie. Ronnie Sox told the interviewer that when Chrysler strapped a computer to his car to measure exactly what he was doing behind the wheel, they discovered he could shift gears faster than an automatic transmission. Not almost as fast. Not within a reasonable margin. Faster. A human being with a clutch pedal and a gear lever was outperforming a mechanical system that was specifically engineered, with no wasted motion, no hesitation, no nerves, to change gears at the optimal moment every single time. The engineers looked at the data. They checked it again. And then they had to accept what they were seeing because the numbers were right there on the printout, and numbers don't have an ego to protect. Now here's the thing. If you already know that story, you probably know the version most people tell. The pro-stock era. The Plymouth muscle cars. The rivalry with Bill Jenkins. The 5 NHRA championship. The years when Ronnie Sox was basically the dominant force in a class that drag racing had essentially invented around his specific skill set. That's the chapter that gets repeated. That's where most of the coverage lives. And it deserves every word written about it. But that's not actually where this story starts, and it's not where the ability came from. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the drivers, the machines, and the forgotten chapters that made drag racing what it is. If you're someone who loves the deep history of motorsport and wants to understand not just what happened but why and how it happened, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Here's what most people don't realize about Ronnie Sox. Before he was the Plymouth factory legend, before Pomona, before Pro Stock, before any of it, there were 12 years of grinding regional competition on Carolina airport strips and small-town drag tracks that almost nobody ever talks about. There were thousands of gear changes on dark roads before he entered a single sanctioned event. There were 48 races won in a row at a local track before anyone outside of Burlington, North Carolina had ever heard his name. There were 4 different factory conversations before Chrysler finally got to him. And there is a full arc, from a kid quietly borrowing his father's Oldsmobile at night to the man who would eventually make drag racing engineers genuinely question whether human beings had physical limits at all. That's what we're going to dig into today. But I want to address something honestly before we go further, because the framing here requires it. The title of this video mentions gasser days, and that requires some real transparency up front. Ronnie Sox was not a gasser racer. There is no credible evidence he ever campaigned a gas coupe and sedan class car. No Willis coupes with straight front axles. No Henry J.S. No Anglias with the nose pointed at the sky. The gasser world had its own legends, its own heroes, its own culture, and Sox simply wasn't part of that lineage. What Sox was, from the very beginning, was a stock and super stock racer. He drove late-model production cars, or very close approximations of them, in every competitive class he ever entered. The reason I'm framing this as his early years rather than abandoning the premise entirely is because the impulse behind that framing is pointing at something genuinely real. Before Sox became the Plymouth factory legend, there was an entire competitive life that almost nobody discusses. And the skills he built during that time are exactly, specifically, and provably what made everything else possible. The story of how Ronnie Sox became Ronnie Sox happens before 1964. It happens on tracks most people have never heard of, in a state that didn't exactly have its name on the national drag racing map yet. So let's go back to Burlington, North Carolina, and figure out where this person actually came from. Burlington sits in the Piedmont region, the rolling middle section of the state between the mountains and the coast. In the late 1950s, it was a textile mill town. His father, Willard Sox Sr., ran a Sinclair gas station on Church Street, and Ronnie grew up in and around that shop, learning how mechanical things worked and, more importantly, learning how to make them work better. The family business name would end up on race cars for years. Sox's Sinclair on the door, a walking advertisement for his father's station. Here's the part about where he grew up that actually matters for this story. The area around Burlington was what people called the Whiskey Belt. This is moonshine country. The Piedmont Hills of North Carolina produced more illegal alcohol in the mid-20th century than almost anywhere else in the country, and the people who ran that whiskey needed fast cars. They needed drivers who could make a machine do things most people couldn't. The culture that produced that entire ecosystem also produced a specific kind of mechanical aptitude and a specific kind of driver. You either understood cars at a deep level or you got caught. That's the world Sox grew up adjacent to, and it shaped what he paid attention to. By the time he was a teenager, Sox had a 1932 Plymouth coupe that his father bought him. And by all accounts, he spent enormous amounts of time with that car, practicing clutch adjustments and gear changes. Not racing yet. Just learning. Learning what a drivetrain actually felt like under his hands. How the clutch engaged. What the gear lever was communicating to him through the metal. One of his Burlington contemporaries, a man named Bud Dowdy, remembered years later that the first time he heard of Sox, it was in the late 1950s when Sox and a guy named Wink Carnes got caught street racing on Church Street. So he wasn't just sitting in the shop theorizing. He was testing what he'd learned on whatever road was available. The Police Club of Burlington started running drag races at a local airport, which is how it worked all over the rural South back then. Abandoned airstrips weren't good for much else. They were long and flat, and if you put up some timing equipment and charged admission, you had a drag strip. Sox showed up with his father's 1949 Oldsmobile Rocket 88. The Rocket 88 is historically significant for a lot of reasons, including being the car some historians credit as the beginning of the muscle car concept, but that's a different video. What matters here is that Sox showed up at that airport strip and immediately started winning. By around 1958, he got serious about it. He bought a Chevrolet with a 348 cubic inch V8, which was Chevy's big performance engine before the 409 arrived. He pulled the engine. He didn't like what the factory had done with it. He put it back together the way he thought it should be done. Changed the rear gear to a 4.56 ratio for quicker acceleration off the line and went back to the strip. The official Sox and Martin team history says he won 48 consecutive races and became the track champion. I want to be straight about something here. That 48 win figure comes from the team's own narrative, not from an independent period source I can independently verify. But every eyewitness account from that era confirms the same basic fact, which is that nobody could beat him on that strip. So the exact number might be slightly different. The fact of the dominance is pretty well established by multiple people who were there. Then, somewhere around 1960, the operation got a serious upgrade. Sox started racing a Pontiac equipped with parts from Ray Nichols Engineering out of Highland, Indiana. Now, Ray Nichols was one of the most respected performance preparation shops in the country at that time, doing work for NASCAR teams and well-funded programs with real budget. The fact that Sox was running Nichols-prepared equipment at this stage tells you something important. His reputation had grown enough to attract that kind of attention. The competition gave that Pontiac a nickname. They called it the Untouchable, which is both an excellent car name and a reasonably accurate description of what it was doing to the field on a consistent basis. This is also when Sox linked up with a Burlington businessman named Jack Ashley. Ashley was apparently successful enough to fund the operation at a higher level and sharp enough at motorsports promotion to help elevate the whole presentation. Together, Sox and Ashley reportedly won 39 out of 40 races during that stretch. The one loss in that run? No record of what happened. Some stories just have gaps like that. Anyway, they were competitive enough that they received delivery of one of the very first 1961 Pontiac Super Duty cars. The Pontiac Super Duty program was Pontiac's factory racing effort before General Motors pulled the plug on all factory motorsport involvement in 1963, and the Super Duty cars were purpose-built drag racing machines inside production-looking bodies. Getting one of the first off the line meant Pontiac knew exactly who Sox was and thought he was worth the hardware. Now, a Burlington resident named Buddy Martin had been racing his own 409 Chevrolet on the same regional circuits where Sox was competing. Martin had worked the textile mills and then the Norfolk and Western Railroad, and had saved enough to buy first a 1958 Corvette and then a 409-powered Chevy. He was decent enough to be competitive at that level. But he kept running into the same problem every single weekend, which was Ronnie Sox. Martin's own quote on this became one of the most famous lines in drag racing history, and it's worth just saying it directly. He said he couldn't beat Ronnie, so he joined him. He said Sox could drive, and he knew he could pull together the deals to go racing. That's the entire partnership summarized in 2 sentences. Sox brought the talent and the reputation. Martin brought the business sense and the deal-making ability. And that business sense was not a minor detail. Martin had an instinct for how to package and present a racing team that was genuinely ahead of its time. Matching uniforms, spotless transporter, cars that looked like they belonged on a showroom floor rather than a backlot somewhere. He understood that factory sponsorship required professional presentation, not just fast quarter-mile times, and he built the team to look the part before any factory had actually signed on. That discipline would prove to be absolutely critical later. Look, at the end of 1962, Martin proposed ordering a 1963 Chevrolet Z11 427 Biscayne. These cars were extraordinary machines. General Motors built approximately 57 of them specifically for drag racing, and each one came with an aluminum block 427-inch engine rated at 430 horsepower, though that number was almost certainly conservative. The front end was aluminum to strip weight. The body panels were thin-gauge steel. Everything unnecessary was deleted at the factory level. Sox would drive it. Martin would own it. The doors said Sox's Sinclair service. The quarter panel said Friendly Chevrolet. They won their first time out in January 1963. Then in February 1963, General Motors announced it was pulling out of all factory racing support. Policy decision from the top. The GM racing withdrawal hit every team running Chevrolet, Pontiac, or any other GM brand at the time. And it left Sox and Martin holding a Z11 with no factory backing and no path forward with the people who built the car. Buddy Martin went to Detroit. He didn't come back with a Chevrolet deal. He came back with Ford. Specifically with Lincoln Mercury. And for 1964, Sox and Martin received a Mercury Comet Caliente built to factory experimental specifications. Factory experimental, or A/FX, was the NHRA class created to accommodate factory lightweight packages that couldn't compete in superstock because they were simply too radically modified to fit the existing rules. Ford had built approximately 21 of these Comets through a company called Dearborn Steel Tubing, and each one had a 427 cubic inch Ford FEV8 with fiberglass body panels, Lexan windows, a stripped interior, and the red, white, and blue paint scheme that would become synonymous with Sox and Martin for the next decade and a half. On February 16, 1964, at the NHRA Winter Nationals in Pomona, California, Ronnie Sox won the A/FX class final against Don Nicholson, who was also running a Mercury Comet. Won it on a hole shot. Sox reacted faster off the line, and Nicholson never caught up. Sox later called that first Pomona win unforgettable, and it's difficult to argue with that description. Because that win was his arrival on the national stage. Not a regional track. Not a match race on a strip nobody outside the county knew about. The Winter Nationals. The biggest event in drag racing. The team ran the match race circuit throughout 1964 and dominated it. Period accounts from that era described Sox picking the front tires up off the ground on every gear change, which had become his visible signature on track. Just the nose of the Comet lifting on each shift, like a tell that the driver in it was doing something the car could barely contain. In the fall of that year, Sox was selected as part of a United States racing team that the NHRA organized to tour English drag strip. The team included Don Garlitz, Tommy Evo, Tony Nancy, Bill Jenkins, Ohio George Montgomery. From the Burlington airport strip to an international exhibition tour in approximately 6 years. That's the arc of what those regional years constructed. And here's what makes that progression remarkable when you actually sit with it. None of those national opportunities happen without the airport strip years. The technique doesn't exist without the dark road practice. The factory attention doesn't arrive without the 48 wins that built the reputation that made Ray Nichols pay attention, that made Jack Ashley see something worth funding, that made Buddy Martin decide joining was smarter than competing, that made Ford see a team worth the hardware, that put Sox on that starting line at Pomona in February 1964 with the right hands on the right shifter at the right moment in drag racing history. This is where it gets really interesting because the Ford deal didn't get renewed for 1965. Sources don't explain this clearly, and I genuinely don't know the full reason. What I can tell you is that it turned out to be the luckiest non-renewal in the history of drag racing, because of exactly what came next. Chrysler Corporation was actively looking for talent. Specifically, Plymouth's product planning operation under a man named Bob Cahill was looking for the best 4-speed manual transmission driver in the country for their 1965 racing program. Cahill sent a former Ram Charger engineer named Dale Reeker to find whoever that was. The Ram Chargers were the famous club of Chrysler engineers who raced their own cars on weekends, whose track successes convinced the Chrysler executive suite to invest seriously in drag racing as a legitimate marketing platform. Reeker was the perfect person for the scouting assignment because he'd been inside that world for years and he understood what elite driving actually looked like, not just fast times on a scorecard but the specific combination of consistency, mechanical intuition, and raw physical ability that separated the best from everyone who was almost the best. He found Ronnie Sox, and there were multiple reasons Chrysler specifically wanted Sox rather than someone else. The 4-speed ability was the obvious one, but also his image. He was clean-cut and professional. He didn't cause problems. He didn't embarrass people in public. He spoke well at promotional events, and Buddy Martin's professional presentation of the team meant Chrysler was signing onto an operation that looked like it already belonged at factory level, not a program that needed to be built from scratch. The deal they struck was described as lucrative and long-term, and it lasted until the mid to late 1970s. There was also a strategic element to Chrysler's 1965 drag racing investment that doesn't get mentioned nearly enough. NASCAR had banned the 426 Hemi engine for the 1965 season. Chrysler responded by boycotting NASCAR entirely. All those racing dollars that had been flowing into stock car racing suddenly had nowhere to go, and Chrysler redirected them into drag racing programs with real purpose and real money behind them. Sox and Martin arrived at exactly the right moment to receive a serious portion of that redirected budget. Timing, preparation, and ability meeting at the same intersection simultaneously. Now let me tell you what Chrysler handed them for 1965. Because this is where the story becomes genuinely remarkable. The regular super stock car was a 1965 Plymouth Belvedere designated the A990, which was a factory drag racing special with a 426 race Hemi under the hood. The race Hemi had aluminum cylinder heads with a 12.5:1 compression ratio, a magnesium cross-ram intake manifold with dual Holley 4-barrel carburetors, and factory-rated horsepower of 425, which was essentially a marketing fiction. Actual output with a race Hemi in race trim was somewhere north of 500 horsepower, probably significantly north of it. The body on the A990 had been acid-dipped to reduce panel thickness until the steel panels were basically starting to become structural suggestions rather than structural members. Fiberglass hood. Fiberglass fenders. Everything they could remove, they remove. But the car that actually made history that year was the altered wheelbase version. Chrysler built approximately 12 of these total, 6 Plymouth Belvederes and 6 Dodge Coronets, and distributed them to their top factory teams. Sox and Martin got a hardtop Belvedere they called the Paper Tiger. What makes an altered wheelbase car is exactly what it sounds like. The axles are in the wrong places. Chrysler moved the rear axle 15 inches forward from its stock location and the front axle 10 inches forward. This pushed the weight distribution significantly rearward so that roughly 56% of the car's weight sat over the rear tires at launch. The body was essentially a fiberglass shell at this point. The entire body panel set for one of these cars weighed 80 pounds. Interiors gutted. Engines initially running carburetors, later converted to Hilborn mechanical fuel injection. On April 24, 1965, at York US 30 Dragway in Pennsylvania, Ronnie Sox ran 9.98 seconds at 136 miles per hour. First driver to break the 9-second barrier in a naturally aspirated door slammer stalker on the East Coast. A production-bodied car. 9 seconds. The West Coast cars had already been there, but on the East Coast, that was the number nobody had touched. Sox got it. The NHRA banned the altered wheelbase cars almost immediately after that. They didn't fit any existing class properly, and the NHRA wasn't sure what to do with machines that were technically production cars but looked like nothing any customer could buy and ran times that embarrassed dedicated purpose-built racers. So Sox ran the Paper Tiger on the match race circuit and at NHRA events where the rules were more flexible. Crowds absolutely loved the thing. It looked genuinely strange. The nose-up stance from the altered axle positions. The wheelbase that looked wrong to anyone who knew what a Belvedere was supposed to look like. One observer described these cars as funny-looking, and that description caught on. There are several competing origin stories for the term funny car in drag racing, but the altered wheelbase Mopars from 1965 are consistently in the conversation for where the name actually came from. Now, you might be thinking that Sox and Martin were on an unstoppable trajectory at this point: factory support, record-setting runs, national attention, growing match race income. And in some ways they were. But here's what most people don't realize about the 1966 season. It introduced both the high point and an important strategic redirection that would define everything that came after. For 1966, the team built a proper funny car. A first-generation Plymouth Barracuda body on a purpose-built tube chassis fitted with a fuel-injected 426 race Hemi running nitromethane and alcohol fuel. 8 26-inch ram tubes sticking up through the hood. Headers by Doug Thorley. Somewhere around 2,200 pounds of race car capable of running in the 8.70s at over 150 miles per hour. They called it the Barracuda. On a good day, Sox reportedly won 70 out of 90 races with that machine. On a bad day, there was Don Nicholson. Nicholson had moved to a proper flip-top funny car by 1966, with a tube chassis and a full fiberglass body instead of a modified production shell. And the difference between where Nicholson was going and where Sox was positioned matters enormously here. Nicholson was evolving toward what funny cars would eventually become. Purpose-built nitro-burning machines with no connection to production vehicles except a fiberglass shell shaped to vaguely resemble one. Sox's Barracuda was still partly tethered to production thinking, and Nicholson was running in the 7s while Sox was in the 8. They added an automatic transmission to the Barracuda, which helped the consistency, but couldn't fully close the gap that the machinery difference created. Then Bob Cahill called Buddy Martin and said something that changed absolutely everything. The quote that came out of that conversation is almost perfect in its clarity. Cahill said, and I'm paraphrasing the documented account here, that the last time he checked, Chrysler didn't sell fuel-altered funny cars. Chrysler wanted its racing program to promote cars that people could actually buy at dealerships, not nitro machines with no meaningful connection to what was sitting on the showroom floor. He told Martin to put Sox back in Superstock. The team complied without argument, and this redirection in 1966 turned out to be the most strategically important decision in Sox and Martin's entire history, because it aimed Sox's specific ability directly at the competitive situation where that ability mattered most. In Superstock and the modified production classes that were evolving toward what would become Pro Stock, the driver was genuinely the variable. In a factory stock car with two competitive entries in the same class, the machinery between them was close enough that who was shifting that 4-speed was often the entire race. Sox had an advantage there that nobody could match mechanically, and Cahill's directive put him in precisely the position to maximize it. Jake King joined the team at some point in 1964 or 1965. King was from Burlington himself, ran a Gulf station on North Church Street, had been racing super stock Fords on the Southern Circuit before Martin recruited him, then went to Detroit for technical seminars on the 426 Hemi and became the team's engine builder for nearly a decade. He was so particular about his engines that he painted every Hemi block Ford blue as his personal signature, his quiet tribute to his roots in Ford racing. King's preparation work is described across multiple independent sources as a consistent horsepower advantage that the other Chrysler teams simply couldn't match on a regular basis. The talent behind the wheel and the precision under the hood, working together in the same program. Starting in 1967, Sox and Martin entered what historians of the sport would eventually recognize as their most dominant era of superstock competition. The 1967 car was a Belvedere 2 with a 426 Street Hemi that their people had modified carefully. Not the full race Hemi configuration, but a warmed-over street unit with a customized intake manifold and upgraded components that pushed it toward race specification without technically crossing the lines the rule book drew. Sox won the NHRA Spring Nationals at Bristol, Tennessee that year. He won the Super Stock and Drag Illustrated Nationals, two major national events in a single season, and this was before Pro Stock existed as a class to win. The Supercar Clinic program also launched in 1967, and this was Buddy Martin's signature business achievement. Here's the thing about the Supercar Clinics that doesn't get enough credit in the historical account. Plymouth dealers across the country wanted a tangible connection to the racing program as a marketing tool, and Martin figured out how to give it to them systematically at scale. Sox and Martin traveled to Plymouth dealerships everywhere, reportedly 265 days a year, doing demonstrations, talking about performance parts, signing autographs, being the human face of Plymouth's racing investment at the retail level where it actually moved cars off lot. Chrysler even paid for Sox and Martin to receive professional public relations and public speaking training, understanding that the program's value extended well beyond the track. The team hired Tom Richardson, who came from Hearst Performance, as drag racing's first dedicated full-time PR manager. The Supercar Clinics were the financial foundation under the entire operation, and they worked because Sox was genuinely good at this part of the job. He was approachable. He could explain what he did in terms regular people understood. He made the technology feel accessible rather than intimidating. For 1968, Chrysler built what might be the most significant factory superstock race car ever constructed. The BO-29 program, which produced the Hemi Barracuda. Plymouth built somewhere between 50 and 72 of these depending on which source you consult, with the number around 70 appearing most frequently in detailed accounts. Each one was assembled at Chrysler's Hamtramck plant, with the engines prepped at the Marysville Marine and Industrial plant, and then both were shipped to Hearst Performance in Madison Heights, Michigan for final conversion. The result was a second-generation Barracuda fastback with a 426 race Hemi, now using cast-iron heads rather than the aluminum units from the earlier cars, a comprehensive lightweight package targeting approximately 3,000 pounds, Kemker glass, thin-gauge steel, lightweight bucket seats, and a stripped interior that kept nothing that wasn't absolutely necessary. Sox and Martin received the first one off the line and debuted it at the 1968 New York Auto Show before it had ever turned a wheel in competition. That detail tells you something about how the partnership between the factory and the team actually functioned. This wasn't just a race car. It was a product announcement, and Sox and Martin were the announcement's face. In competition that year, the car was almost unfair. Sox won the NHRA Spring Nationals in Superstock, won the NHRA U.S. Nationals in Superstock, was named NHRA Driver of the Year, won the NHRA World Championship in the class. In 1969, he came back with the same basic package and won the Spring Nationals again, which was his third consecutive Spring Nationals Superstock title. Won the U.S. Nationals Superstock class running 10.89 at 124.82 miles per hour. Won both the NHRA and NHRA World Championship. World Championships, plural, in the same season. That's 6 NHRA national event wins before Pro Stock was even a class that existed to win. And the pattern is completely consistent across 3 consecutive years of national competition at the highest level of production-based drag racing. So by the time the NHRA was ready to create Pro Stock in 1970, Sox wasn't a prospect. He was the proven, documented champion of exactly the kind of racing they were formalizing into a new class structure. Let me talk about how he actually drove the car here, because this part deserves its own careful explanation, and it's the key to understanding everything. The key to understanding Ronnie Sox's competitive advantage is the Chrysler A833 4-speed manual transmission mated to a Hurst Competition Plus shifter. In Superstock and later Pro Stock, the cars were using production or near-production manual transmissions, and the driver had to actually work the clutch and shift the lever under full acceleration at wide-open throttle, while simultaneously managing reaction time and Racekraft. The technical term for what Sox did is power shifting. You don't fully disengage the clutch between gears. You release the throttle briefly while moving the lever, and the clutch just takes the load. Done correctly, you lose minimal time between gears. Done incorrectly, you miss the gear or you break something expensive. Usually both. Sox described his setup in a 1985 interview. He ran the clutch linkage very tight and used short shift levers. Tight linkage means the clutch engages very quickly after you begin releasing the pedal. Short lever means the movement required to change gears is minimal. Less travel equals less time. He had been developing the feel for exactly the right moment to engage since he was practicing on that 1932 Plymouth on Carolina roads as a teenager. This is not metaphor. This is a direct mechanical continuity between the kid learning on back roads and the man making engineers question their data. The thing that actually quantifies the advantage most clearly is what happened in 1973 when the NHRA Pro Stock rules allowed teams to switch to Lenco planetary transmissions. Lenco gearboxes are clutchless. You push a button or a lever and the transmission shifts itself through a planetary gear set. No clutch pedal. No traditional shift lever motion. Just input and change. These transmissions were engineered specifically to eliminate the human variable in gear changing and give every driver the fastest possible shift time, regardless of their individual skill level. Every driver who switched to the Lenco got faster. Some by as much as a full tenth of a second per pass. Every driver except one. Sox's car went slower when it switched to the Lenco. By approximately 0.04 of a second. The only driver in Pro Stock whose times went the wrong direction when everyone received better technology was the driver who had been beating the technology manually for years. Work backward from those numbers and what you actually get is this. Sox's human shifting was approximately 10 to 0.04 of a second per pass better than any other driver in the field. And the Lenco only closed that gap by bringing everyone else up to a level that still didn't quite match what Sox had been doing by hand all along. That's not talent in the conventional sense of the word. That's some other category of physical capability that we don't really have good language for. Buddy Martin described it the way someone who had been watching it for years would. He said Ronnie's skills as a driver were a gift. He said other drivers would miss gears left and right, and that never happened with Ronnie. He said Ronnie could get into anyone else's car and have no problems whatsoever. Bob Cahill, the Plymouth executive who recruited him, put it differently. Cahill said it was a pure joy to listen to his engines when he ran because there was no pause, no over-revving. He said Sox was so good he really didn't need a tachometer to know when to shift. That last detail, not needing a tachometer, is both accurate and genuinely staggering to sit with. A tachometer exists specifically to tell the driver when to shift, when they can't feel the engine precisely enough to know on their own. When you don't need one because you can feel the engine state with enough accuracy to know exactly when you're at the shift point, it means the information is being processed somewhere below the conscious decision-making level entirely. You're not reading a gauge and making a decision. You're shifting because your nervous system already knows, and the conscious mind is just along for the ride. Now, you might be thinking that this kind of ability either exists or it doesn't, that some people are born with it and most aren't, and that the story of how Sox developed it is interesting but ultimately secondary to the fact that he had it. Here's what most people don't realize. The ability absolutely exists on a spectrum, and where you end up on that spectrum is not fixed at birth. It's built. It's constructed through repetition at a level most people never approach, over a time frame most people never sustain, on the specific kind of machinery that demands it. The thousands of practice gear changes on a 1932 Plymouth. The airport strip sessions where consistency was the only measure that mattered. The 48-race stretch where every single run was another data point being recorded somewhere in the nervous system without the driver consciously filing it. This is where it gets really interesting, and this is the insight that changes how you understand the whole story. The Lenco data from 1973 didn't reveal a natural gift. It revealed the end product of approximately 15 years of deliberate practice at the specific physical skill that the technology was trying to replicate mechanically. The engineers weren't looking at a freak of nature. They were looking at the output of a system that had been running long enough to achieve something their machine couldn't quite match. So that's the shape of the story when you lay it out completely. A kid from a Carolina gas station who spent his teenage years practicing gear changes on whatever vehicle his father would let him near. Who showed up at an airport strip in 1958 and didn't lose for a very long time. Who ran Pontiac hardware with parts from one of the best performance shops in the country and got a nickname from the people who kept finishing behind him. Who found in Buddy Martin not just a business partner but the organizational intelligence that his driving talent needed around it to reach a national stage. Who won the first significant national event he entered, at Pomona in February 1964. And then built from that moment through Mercury and into Chrysler's factory program, and the Paper Tiger and the Supercar Clinics, and the BO-29 Barracuda dominance, and 6 national event wins before Pro Stock gave him the specific arena where his ability would become the thing drag racing history most clearly remembers. The gasser world had Ohio George Montgomery and Stone, Woods and Cook and Big John Mazmanian and Hubert Platt and Gene Cromerger. Those were the names on the modified old body cars with the nose pointed at the sky and the straight front axle and the Mooneyham blowers and the pure theater of the class. Sox was never part of that world. He was building his own thing on the production car circuit in the Carolina Piedmont at the exact same time those guys were building theirs. 2 different lineages of drag racing culture existing in parallel, developing separately, both pointing toward a future that neither had quite invented yet, and neither one fully understood the other's discipline from the outside. The legacy is documented most honestly in the numbers. 5 NHRA Pro Stock Championship, More than 46 national event wins across NHRA and HRA competition combined. Number 15 on NHRA's own ranking of the 50 greatest drivers from 1951 through 2000. First drag racers inducted into the North Carolina Motorsports Hall of Fame. Motorsports Hall of Fame of America. International Drag Racing Hall of Fame. And the 1973 Lenco data, which remains the most honest version of the legacy because it doesn't require anyone's opinion or memory or selective emphasis. Just before and after times from a technology switch that inadvertently revealed what the driver had been doing manually all along, in every race, 4 years, on a level nobody else in the class could touch. Sox died in April 2006. He was 67 years old and had been fighting prostate cancer for approximately 3 years. 1 month after he died, his widow Alicia established the Ronnie Sox Foundation to benefit St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, which tells you something real about what he thought mattered beyond the track, beyond the championships, beyond the hardware and the deals and the national event wins. Buddy Martin, by most recent accounts, is apparently still working at a car lot, still in North Carolina, still alive, which means the business half of the partnership has outlasted the driving half by close to 2 decades now. The Jim Child book from 2016 is the most complete account of the team's history and was written with the active cooperation of Martin and other people who were actually present for the events it describes. If you want the deepest available version of this story, that's where to go. The 1974 book that Sox and Martin wrote with Bill Neely, called the Sox and Martin Book of Drag Racing, is extremely scarce now, but it's the first-person account and the early years are in there. Look, what I keep coming back to with Sox is the continuity. The specific, unbroken continuity. The kid practicing clutch feel on a 1932 Plymouth on Carolina roads, and the man who outperformed a computer-controlled automatic transmission in a controlled measurement are the same person doing the same fundamental thing at different levels of refinement and in very different contexts. The airport strip wins and the Winter Nationals win and the U.S. Nationals wins and the Spring Nationals title 3 years running are all expressions of the same skill, built over the same number of years, on the same kind of machinery, through the same process of showing up and doing it again and again until the doing stopped requiring thought. It didn't appear. It wasn't discovered. It wasn't handed to him by circumstance or luck or genetics alone. It was constructed, methodically and without much fanfare, track by track and weekend by weekend and gear change by gear change, on strips that are parking lots now and roads that were never designed or intended for what he was using them for. By the time Chrysler's engineers sat with the printout that seemed to show something impossible, he had been doing it for so long and so consistently that it had stopped feeling like anything particular to him at all. It had become, in the truest sense of the word, second nature. The nature he had spent 15 years building one gear change at a time, starting on a 1932 Plymouth, before anyone outside of Burlington, North Carolina had any reason to know his name. That's the real story of Ronnie Sox. Not just the championships, not just the factory deal, not just the moments that made the headlines and the record books. The story is the years nobody photographed, the track sessions nobody officially timed, the thousands of repetitions on roads and strips that didn't have a program with his name in it. Because those years are why the rest of it happened at all. And if you understand that, you understand something about greatness in motorsport that applies well beyond one driver and one class and one era. If this kind of deep dive history is what you want more of, hit the subscribe button and stay with us. There's a lot more where this came from. This is Legacy Motoring.